This is a very, very brief introduction to JavaScript. My name is Dr. Renaud from Shawnee State University. Remember that JavaScript is kind of one of the three parts that make up most web pages. There's HTML for the content, there's CSS for the presentation, and then there's JavaScript for all of the kind of activity. But JavaScript is a lot more than just a language in a web page. It's a general purpose computer programming language. It can do virtually anything. It's often embedded in other systems. You'll not only find JavaScript embedded in web browsers and in web pages, but you'll also find JavaScript embedded in several game engines and several industrial systems also. Remember that it's called JavaScript. It's a scripting language, it's not compiled, so it's actually read and interpreted on the fly by the system that's using it. That kind of causes some issues with speed, but it's still pretty darn fast. JavaScript, the language, is case sensitive, so variable names, function names, and you might not even know what those are yet, but just know that everything in JavaScript is case sensitive. So the uppercase letter A is different than the lowercase letter A. All lines and statements in JavaScript need to close with a semicolon, colon with a tail, semicolon. JavaScript is object-oriented, so you can do all kinds of really cool stuff with it. And JavaScript can be kind of difficult to understand. There are lots of ways to write JavaScript. There are lots of ways to do just about any one thing. Every programmer will often do things differently. You can make your JavaScript completely unreadable and obscure, or you can take it easy and you can slow down and you can think about it and you can make a lot of cool stuff easily with JavaScript. Remember also that JavaScript is not Java. Java is a compiled language that also runs on set-top boxes and automobiles and all kinds of devices. But JavaScript and Java are very, very dissimilar in some ways, but they have the same curly Q's and semicolons. So they're sort of similar that way. But Java and JavaScript are nowhere near the same computer programming language. Just a little bit of history. JavaScript was originally created in 1995 by an engineer named Brendan Eich for a company called Netscape. Netscape doesn't exist anymore, but back in the early and middle 90s, Netscape made one of the best of the web browsers. There was Netscape's web browser, and then there was Internet Explorer, the Microsoft web browser, and there were a couple of others. And the Netscape web browser was the one that everybody really used. It was the most complete web browser. Soon thereafter, though, because Netscape wanted everybody to use JavaScript and to use this new scripting language and to compete against Microsoft's ASP language, which is not the same as their ASP.NET language, which is a totally different language with a similar name. They allowed the standard for JavaScript to be managed by a group called the ECMA. Back a long time ago, the ECMA was known as the European Computer Manufacturers Association, but they now just go by the four letters ECMA. And the current version of JavaScript is version 5. In a browser, JavaScript can be used to generate, can be used to display dynamic content. It can be used to reach out to a web server and get content dynamically. It can be used to store data locally on the web browser. It can be used to animate. It can be used to validate forms. It can be used for slideshows and menu control. You can control each of the CSS elements or CSS attributes of an element. You can control elements on a page. You can do just about almost anything you could think of. Well, except you can't reach out into the local file system of the computer that the web browser is running on, because that would allow someone to write malicious JavaScript that could infect your computer. So remember that the JavaScript lives truly within the web browser and doesn't leave the web browser to manipulate your computer unless you give it permissions to access some of your other devices. JavaScript is embedded into an HTML document in one of three ways. It can be added to a tag as an event handler, and we'll see some examples of that in a moment. It can be embedded between HTML's script tags, script open and script close, and you just type your JavaScript statements inside between those two tags. And you can do that either in the head or in the body. Now, if it's done in the head, it's processed before the body starts to display. And if it's done in the body, the the web browser will actually display the stop, process the JavaScript, and then go on and continue running. And we'll see an example of that. And the third way, JavaScript is embedded into an HTML document is it can be loaded from an external file, and you'll see the statement to do that also. The first thing I wanted to do was show how to embed JavaScript between the script tags. So you can see there in the middle of the page, there's an H1 that says first part of page, and then there's a script. And the script then ends a couple lines later, and then there's the second H1. Inside the script is a single line of JavaScript, and it's the alert statement. Alert is one of those things that's built into JavaScript's language, and alert makes a little pop-up box appear with a message and an OK button, just like a little box that pops up and annoys you and says, here's something, click OK. So you can see that it says click OK to see the rest of the page. So when this page is actually loaded into the web browser, when you open it up in your web browser, it's going to display the first header, and then it's going to stop. A pop-up box will appear saying, click OK to see the rest of the page. You'll click OK, that box will disappear, and the rest of the page will display in the browser. Do you want to be doing that to your users on a website? Probably not, but we could certainly call this our very first JavaScript. Second way, you can have your JavaScript sitting in a separate file somewhere on another server or in the same folder as your HTML, and you can load it in, which comes in handy because that way you can use the same JavaScript scripts across multiple websites, couldn't you, or multiple web pages. And you do that by saying script src equal, using the attribute src, short for source. src equals, quote, whatever the name of your JavaScript or whatever the URL. You could even load it from a remote server if you want. So you'd put the URL to the remote file, and be sure that you have the closed script, because if you don't, the HTML will think your whole document is script, and it'll just not work. So you've got to have that closed script tag on the script loading it remotely, even though when you load in a CSS page remotely, you don't have to do that, but you do here. So we use the script tag using the src with a URL, and that'll go get that external JavaScript file and load it into your page. The third way that you can add JavaScript to your page is to add an event handler. And an event handler is just like what it sounds. It handles an event. When something happens, the JavaScript executes when the user clicks on something or whatever. But let's look at these. Basically, what you do is you add an attribute to an HTML tag, and when that event happens to that HTML tag, then the JavaScript executes. That's kind of cool. The 5 events that are the most common, even though there are lots more, are the on click, on double click, on load, on mouse over, and on mouse out. So the on click event happens when a user clicks on something. The on double click happens when a user double clicks on something. The onload event happens after the page fully loads, then the onload event is called. So after a page loads, the onload events are called. The on mouse over is exactly what it sounds like. When the user moves the mouse over the element, the on mouse over event happens, and on mouse out happens when the user's mouse leaves the element. So we can use JavaScript to make the element do things when the mouse moves over it and moves away from it. We can also do that with CSS using the hover pseudo element or the pseudo selector, but we can do even more really sophisticated animations and all kinds of other things using the on mouse over and on mouse out. Let's look at an example of a couple of event handlers. In this example HTML code, I have two event handlers. On the body, I have an onload event. So when the body is done loading, when the page first renders, it will render the entire page, and then it will call the onload event. So when the page fully loads, it'll then do an alert and say page loaded. And you click OK, and you can then see the page. We'll add onload events for all kinds of things, but I just wanted to show this onload event here so that you knew kind of where a page onload would go and what it would kind of look like. Your code inside the quotation marks could be different, different code for different things. And then notice that on the fourth to bottom line, you'll see there's a span in the middle of that paragraph that has an on click. And then it says on click equal, and inside is some JavaScript that says, hey, you clicked me. So if the user clicks on the words click me, the event handler happens and the alert box pops up to remind them that they did it. So the on click fires when the user clicks on the span because that's where we've put it. Be careful when you're putting quotation marks inside of quotation marks. Notice that in our previous example, I used double quotes inside of the script tag, but here, because I'm inside an attribute's values are already in double quotes, so I'm using single quotes inside. So the string of the string in JavaScript is the message. Page loaded or you clicked me is something called a string, and a string is surrounded in either double quotes or single quotes, not both, not one or the other. So be careful with your quotes inside of quotes and make sure that you're consistently nesting them correctly. This concludes our really quick lightning fast introduction to a little bit of JavaScript. This video presentation was copyright 2020 by James M. Renault, PhD. All rights are reserved. I'd also like to say thanks for watching.